good evening, good afternoon to all our participants who've taken out time today to join our webinar for PCI DSS version 4. The version 4 has been much anticipated and it's finally here. I'd like to first introduce us, Accorian, as a brand. Accorian is a cybersecurity services company. We're based out of New Jersey. We are a high-trust assessor, a SOC 2 assessor, and a PCI ASV. We've completed over 400 engagements across ISO, SOC, NIST, GDPR, PCI, high trust, and HIPAA. And today, we kind of span our services across multiple industries, whether it's health, financial services, e-commerce, retail, SaaS, media, and B2B tech. My name's Aaditya. I am the MD and Chief Cybersecurity Officer at Accorian. I have a multitude of experience in pen testing to security compliance. I'm joined with Andrea, who's part of our compliance services team. She comes with over 30 years of experience, and I'll let her say hi in a sec. She comes with over 30 years of experience in IT and security, and she is an expert in PCI and high trust. So she's the right person to have on for today's webinar.
Hi, everybody.
Andrea, that's good.
Yeah.
Great. So I'd like to first quickly talk about, what are the benefits of the security attestation or certification? Today, businesses, as they grow, they work with multiple of their clients, their service providers. They might be partners to various bigger brands or, brands across the world. Today, security has truly become table stakes for doing business, in a sense that in order to showcase assurance of your client's data, security certification of any kind, whether it's PCI, whether it's SOC 2, ISO, high trust, is the ways and means of showcasing this, right? This allows you to build trust, improve your overall security because it's a framework and a benchmark to work towards. It also requires a third-party certification that ensures that your security program is truly meets the requirement set by this framework or standard, thus making you secure. It enables you to work with customers of all sizes, and it takes the question of security off the table by virtue of you having a certification across any of the security frameworks today. And lastly, it allows you to continuously improve your security posture and be ready for the emerging threats of today. So I'd like to quickly touch upon what is PCI DSS. Now, the PCI DSS standard was formulated by the 4 big payment brands, Visa, MasterCard, Discover, and JCB, with the entire aim of creating a benchmark or a framework that they'd want their acquirers or their merchants and other vendors to meet and comply by, right? This enabled them to have a uniform standard that all these vendors and suppliers and partners and acquirers and merchants would meet. Now, PCI applies to 2 types of organizations. If you're a company that transmits, processes, or stores credit card data of any type, then you come under the direct purview of PCI DSS, a payment card industry data security standard. Next, if you're a company that's involved in any credit card transaction, then PCI DSS will be apt for you as well. And lastly, I want to quickly talk about a new emerging trend that we are seeing. If you're working with an organization or a client that uses PCI DSS as their benchmark to showcase security assurance, then you, by virtue of being the supplier or vendor, may also be required to meet this requirement. Now, coming to the PCI and how they assess various merchants and various types of organizations, there are 4 levels of merchants. It's typically decided by your annual transaction volume. So if you're doing more than 6 million transactions, then you fall under the level 1 category, which requires you to do a full report on compliance, or a ROC, which is a full qualified security assessor audit. So there has to be a third party, which is a PCI QSA, which has to come and conduct an audit on your entire program and attest whether this particular program and framework that you've built internally meets the requirement of PCI. So that's level 1. The level 2, level 3, and level 4 are for organizations that have lesser volume of transactions, starting all the way from 20,000 or lesser to about, about 6 million, right? And for these organizations, they need to fill out an SAQ or a self-assessment questionnaire. There are about 8 different types of SAQs, and the type of SAQ that you would need to meet would depend on the way that you process payment card information. We often see that a lot of merchants or organizations may not be touching upon any credit card data, but by virtue of being a service provider, they need to still comply by PCI's requirement. And the SAQ-D is applicable to service providers of various natures, where you could be a technology service provider, a SaaS provider, or even a provider that's providing services for payment brands and bigger banks or other financial institutions. Today, it's become a de facto standard to showcase assurance. Organizations that are level 2, level 3, and level 4 do have the opportunity to go and invite a qualified assessor, a PCI QSA, to conduct an audit on their program to certify them as well, but this is not mandatory. This is something that's done sometimes by certain brands when they want to show a higher level of assurance, right? That said, to reiterate, a level 2, level 3, level 4 merchant would just need to fill out their SAQ annually and submit it to their acquirer or their client. A PCI ASV or a PCI approved scan is mandatory across all merchant levels. Now, that's the history and everything, the background on PCI DSS. Before I hand it off to Andrea real quick, I want to talk about what is the current version. So the current version 3.2.1 was released in 2018. We've seen, the world change ever since. We've gone to the cloud, there are new emerging threats, right, etc. So PCI DSS came up with a much due and much awaited version 4. To talk about it further, Andrea is going to give you a deep dive into what to expect in version 4.
Thanks, Aaditya. So I would also like to welcome everybody and thank you for being here with us today for our webinar. So when the PCI Council knew that they needed to update their standards, they sat down and actually developed 4 goals that they knew needed to be met with that new version that they wanted to come out with, which is version 4. So on our screen here is the 4 goals of the council for this update. So the first one was to make sure that the standard continued to meet the security needs of the payment industry. So we all know that when PCI first started, there wasn't much cloud-based or serverless, container-based types of situations where it was mostly an on-prem situation. So now they've built into this version 4 some additional guidance and information about assessing against those cloud-based and serverless types of environments. Updating the standard clarifies how to meet the requirements when using those types of technologies. The second goal was to add flexibility to support the different methodologies being used to achieve security. So we're going to talk a little bit more about these in depth, but there is the defined approach, which is the standard way that we approach assessing and testing the controls against your environment. But now they have a customized approach. So we're going to go into that in a little bit more detail later, which was the change for version 4. Their third goal was to promote security as a continuous process. So constantly monitoring and analyzing your card data environment, instead of just looking at it once a year when you're doing your assessment, there's this continuous process to make sure that you're compliant, now required under version 4. And then the fourth goal was to make sure that it enhanced the validation methods and the procedures that were used within the standard. So let's take a look at that first goal in depth. So we've a couple of examples. So the title of our webinar today was the 64 changes that were made under version 4. We're obviously not going to be able to go into detail about those 64 changes, but what we've done is try to take the high points, the ones that we think will have the most impact on an organization, And we also took into account that there was a timeline for certain of these particular requirement changes that need to be met prior to the full 64 being met. So we're going to focus on those today. So that first goal and some examples of how version 4 is working to meet that ever-changing security need of the payment industry. Multi-factor has always been a requirement for remote access into the cardholder data environment, or the CDE. However, now multi-factor is required for all access into the CDE. So that does have an impact on some organizations. Another example of how they're trying to meet the changing security needs is passwords. So complexity for passwords now is changed from 7 required characters to 12 to meet those security goals. And passwords must still change every 90 days. However, and this is the change, that only applies to systems without multi-factor. So if MFA is implemented, those password changing requirements of every 90 days can be marked NA. Oops. So that second goal, increasing the flexibility to support different methodologies. So group, shared, and generic accounts were never allowed to be used within the CDE in previous versions of the standard. However, because there are certain instances where entities need to use those group accounts or shared accounts, in version 4, it is allowed to use those type of accounts as long as the use of those accounts is managed. So you've got to have a limited time frame for when those accounts are being used. You've got to have approvals documented for why those accounts exist, and then making sure that actions while using those accounts can be tied back to an individual. So you've got to be able to see who's using those accounts when in fact they're making modifications or changes within the environment. So one of the best examples for how version 4 increases the flexibility to support the different methodologies is allowing the performance of targeted risk analyses. So as a result of those analyses, organizations can now do things like determine frequencies for performing certain activities. For example, if you perform a targeted risk analysis and you can show that the frequency for periodic evaluations to look at those systems that we know are not known to be affected by malware, as long as you perform that risk analysis and you can support that, then you can, you wouldn't have to look at those systems as frequently as what PCI would originally have wanted you to. Another example is looking at those POI device inspections. If you can do that risk analysis and show that you don't need to do that as often because of either the placement of the POI or other factors, then version 4 gives you the ability to do that. So I talked earlier about that customized approach versus the defined approach. So these two different validation methods are available to entities when they're using version 4. So that defined approach, that traditional method still exists, and it will continue to exist. So that's going to be following those current PCI DSS requirements and the testing procedures that are built in. And this would be suitable for entities with security implementations that align with those current requirements. They're still using systems that align with those type of testing and requirements. And the one thing that version 4 does is in that defined approach, it also provides good direction on how to meet the security objectives, even in that traditional methodology of testing. The customized approach, which is new for version 4, it allows assessed entities, and these are going to be entities with a more mature and robust security processes in place, and additionally with a strong risk management practice. Using those risk analyses, they can focus on the objective of each requirement. So the objective, that's the key word of the requirement. And if for a reason that the entity determines that they don't meet the objective in that traditional way, they can perform that risk assessment and determine and show that the implementation of that control would be met based on how they perform that control. So this provides greater flexibility for those entities using different ways to achieve a requirement's security objective. So, but it's very important. So about those targeted risk analyses, it has to be documented. So in those instances where you're an organization, again, that has that robust security program in place, and you've got good risk management practices, you should be working with your assessor if in fact you're going to use that new methodology, because you want to ensure that as you're doing that risk analyses and you're developing how you're going to meet the requirement, you want to make sure you're talking with your assessor who's going to be eventually testing that requirement to ensure that everybody agrees that in fact how you're approaching it will be in fact suitable to meet the PCI intent. And in addition, it gives the assessor the opportunity to see the new methodology and how you're going to meet that requirement, because obviously the traditional test for a requirement would need to be updated. The old test would not be valid if you're meeting that objective of the control in a different way. So that's up to the assessor to actually write a new test around how you are meeting certain controls if you're using that new methodology. So all that being said, you need to work with your assessors. So goal 3 of the council was to promote security as a continuous process. So how are they looking at that? We see throughout the updated ROC and updated standard that more emphasis has been placed on roles and responsibilities. So we know they always had roles and responsibilities where you had to define them during your assessment. However, they've moved them up to be of place greater emphasis on them. And what they are mandating is that roles need to be documented, assigned, and understood. So what does that mean? Where would you document a specific role and responsibilities? That's going to be your policy and procedures. So the impact, and it could be a large impact on organizations, would be that your P&Ps need to be updated. So, and what does assigned mean? So you're assigning that role and responsibility. A lot of discussion about, do you assign that to a person, or maybe it makes more sense in your policy and procedure to assign it to a specific role or a job title versus someone's name within the organization. So, and then here's the big one, understood. So there needs to be some type of acknowledgement from that current person in the role that's responsible for that, for accepting and understanding what that responsibility is. So documentation, again, could be a big impact on organizations. So another impact could be that for companies that are trying to automate as much as possible, think about using a GRC tool, and if you've got defined roles and responsibilities within that tool, you'll need to update the GRC tool to make sure that you're getting everything correct as far as documentation and matching what your P&Ps are. One good thing about this, though, is that the smaller assessed entities, it may help them to change that mentality that the responsibility for security just falls on one person. Because when you document and get that acknowledgement, that one person, that go-to person for everybody may have some pushback on what their responsibilities are. So it's good guidance as well, which leads me to my next bullet point, which is guidance. So throughout the whole version 4, the updates, you'll see a lot of new guidance, which can help organizations better understand how to implement and maintain security. One example is the definition of what in place means, especially in those SAQs, those self-assessment questionnaires. So for anybody performing that self-assessment, if they're not using an assessor, it gives them a little bit better definition of what in place means. And then a new definition or a new designation is in place with remediation. So that's new. So this is where if during an assessment, a control fails, however, the assessed entity is either in the process of changing that or remediating that, or if after it fails, there's still time for them to do the remediation within the time period of the assessment still ongoing, then the assessor can select in place with remediation. And the reason that they put that there was, it provides more transparency to any reader of that final report that, hey, this entity did have this issue, but they've been able to remediate it. And then for the assessor side, that would be something that you would put as one of the things you would look at the next year to make sure that that remediation still was in place and working. The fourth goal of the council in version 4 was to enhance the validation methods and procedures used. So some examples of this were the information that is actually contained in a ROC or an SAQ. They better aligned that information in the attestation of compliance, the AOC, which is basically the scaled down version of what happened during your assessment. So the AOC is more robust. It contains more information than what it did. And one of the things that it does do is it identifies those different methodologies. So if you're using that customized approach, it actually tells the reader at that level, at that definitive, that smaller level, that that somebody used a customized approach, an entity used a customized approach versus a standard approach methodology for testing. So, which again also provides transparency when merchants or service providers only share that AOC with their customers. That still gives the customer that transparency to see that a customized approach was used there. So those were the 4 goals, but we also found that there were other significant changes that we thought would warrant a mention here in our webinar. So one was scope. So scope is big. Scope is always big, and it's always been a challenge, and it doesn't matter what type of assessment you're doing. Both assessed entities and assessors always struggle to define scope. So in PCI, you have your tier 1 systems. So those are the ones that store, process, and handle the cardholder data. Those are easy, you know those need to be in scope. But there were always questions about those tier 2 systems, those that attached systems on the peripheral. So the goal in both assessors' minds and assessed entities was to always minimize the scope as much as possible without compromising, obviously, the validity of the assessment. But version 4 has new scope requirements. They've actually helped define it, especially around those tier 2 systems. So if you have a question, or originally had a question about those attached systems, whether or not they'd be in scope, version 4 gives you clear, definitive answers about whether or not that needs to be there. So, which brings me to my next bullet point here. A lot of controls in a lot of different types of assessments, but PCI for one, it requires things to happen when there's a, quote, significant change to the environment. Everybody's seen that. So, but that's always been a question. What is defined as significant change to the environment? So this is where the council really stepped up and clearly defined what after a significant change means. So they define a significant change as a new hardware or software in that cardholder data environment, upgrades to hardware and software, flow of information changes, which makes sense. And then if you have any change in the vendors or service providers that you're using, that warrants looking at it as a significant change. In addition, change to the organizational structure. This is something assessed entities may not look at, but if there's been a merger or an acquisition, a lot of times entities that are in the process of being merged or they may be using systems in parallel with the old company versus the new company or both companies. If any of those systems could qualify as being a tier 2 system on the peripheral of a cardholder data environment, that would be considered a significant change. So what entities need to do is to evaluate, perform those risk analyses to determine how those mentioned items might affect, number 1, the scope, and then number 2, what might it trigger. So I can think of several things that a change in the environment might trigger, which would be policy and procedure update, or even those roles and responsibility updates, among others. Another pretty significant change is the use of the term cardholder data versus account data. So this is a new term that we all need to get used to in PCI. So you always used to ask, is cardholder data involved, right? So now they're saying account data. So what that means is the standard always defined cardholder data as the account number, the name, expiration date, and a service code. Then they define sensitive authentication data as the full track, what's on the magnetic stripe, card verification codes, and PINs. So most of the requirements in the standard either referenced cardholder data or sensitive authentication data. Some requirements were kind of confusing about what it really applied to, and they weren't very clear. So what version 4 does is updating that requirement to clarify all those requirements to clarify what each control applies to, and account data is now both cardholder data and sensitive authentication data. So that's another pretty big change. I think I mentioned PNPs a couple of times, and that's one thing that we noticed as well as another significant change. They moved up the PNP requirements in the testing, within each of the sections, to bring it more in the forefront. So they're really putting emphasis on PNPs and maybe giving them more importance than what they used to. And we think this is a good thing because this brings PCI compliance into having more of a program management approach. So you document your policy, you document and define your procedures, and then for how you meet that policy requirement, then you assign those roles and responsibilities, and then you implement the control. So this is a more logical approach, we think. Automated log review for all cardholder data environment and critical in-scope supporting infrastructure, including payment pages, now require 24/7 log monitoring or the use of a SIM, basically. So you need that detection and the response for that monitoring. So one thing that we think is also significant, it may not seem this way to all, but anybody that knew what the requirement numbers were by heart, virtually all the requirement numbers have now changed. So they've all been renumbered. So I've got a friend that does a lot of PCI work, and I'm sure he's in freak out mode now because he could cite which requirement was which based on the number. So he's going to have to relearn a whole bunch of things. And there's additional numbers, obviously. So, but that could be another impact to anybody using a GRC tool, because if they've input those based on a number, then all that needs to change with version 4. Another, and I think the last, second to last that we're going to talk about is the appendices. So the appendices are all different as well. So Appendix A used to be shared hosting providers, and now it's specific to guidance on assessing multi-tenant service providers. Appendix D is now that customized approach, so that's a new appendix. And then Appendix E is a guideline for performing that targeted risk assessment or targeted risk analyses. F is support and leveraging the PCI software security framework. And then Appendix G, which is new, which is nice, they've brought the glossary, instead of making it a separate document, they've now brought that in as Appendix G. So timelines, speaking of that, how are we doing on time? I think we're good. So this is the timeline that we got directly from the PCI Council. And you can see that version 4, it was officially released in the first quarter of this year in March of 2022. Previous version was 3.2.1. And that version is going to remain active until March 31st of 2024. So over a year from now. So this gives organizations the time to adjust to all those new standards, to the new requirements. Then on March 31st, 2024, 3.2.1 will be retired. So what that means is anybody using version 4, starting from back in even Q1 of this year, up until March 31st of 2024, they have given us 13 of those 64 updates. Those 64 new things are mandatory. So let me say that again. Version 4, if you're going to assess against version 4, starting now until March 31st, 2024, there are 13 of those new things we talked about that are required. They're mandatory. The other remaining 51 would be considered best practices until another year from that time. So until March 31st of 2025. So 13 you need to worry about now if you're going to assess against version 4. And then the other 51 will need to be mandatory after March of 2025. One thing to note for those of you that may be QSA companies, There is now a requirement that if you're going to assess an assessed entity, if you're going to perform assessment for someone and using version 4, that QSA company, they must have been trained on version 4 before you can perform any assessments. And that actually is noted if anybody's looking for an assessor company and wants to use version 4. On the PCI website, it actually notes if that particular QSA company has been trained in version 4. All right, so these are the 13 that are effective now if you're going to use version 4. And you can see that roles and responsibilities documented, assigned, acknowledged, and understood for each of these requirements or sections in the standard. There's 10 of them. Those are mandatory if you're going to assess against version 4. So again, we see that importance of those P&Ps being updated. And then those remaining 3 are here. If you're using that customized approach, you've got to document those roles and responsibilities and assign them and have that acknowledgement of understanding. Scope has always been documented and confirmed every 12 months. That's not a change, but if you're a service provider, you now have to document and confirm your scope every 6 months. And then again, whenever, using that new definition of whenever there is a significant change to the environment. Third-party service providers also must respond to requests from their customers to provide their compliance status to PCI and identify which requirements they are responsible for as that third-party provider to their clients. All right, now I'm going to turn the floor over to Aaditya, and he's going to talk about changes that affect service providers.
Thanks, Andrea. So taking a leaf off where Andrea left off on service providers, I wanted to, quickly chat about what kind of changes can you expect. If you're a SaaS technology provider, if you're an MSP or a cloud service provider, these are some of the changes that you need to look out for and ensure you start working towards them immediately so that you have adequate time to meet, the version 4 requirements. And they range from MFA to automated log reviews to authenticated internal vulnerability scans to the fact that service providers must support any request from their clients, especially facilitating penetration testing activities, etc. But there's one very, very important point that Andrea had raised, which was reassessing and validating scope every 6 months. And the main reason for this was PCI has realized, and as the standard has improved, to understand that today's SMB or mid-market or enterprise works with dozens of service providers, whether it's on technology or SaaS or MSP or CSPs, right? Hence, it's very, very important because their end data lies with these service providers. It is very important that this data is secured, and PCI is taking adequate steps to ensure that these service providers are showcasing any changes to their environment and signing off on them. Now, some of these changes are, especially for service providers, but they are also, in line with the other requirements that some of the, all the merchants need to comply by, which is enhanced phishing detection capabilities and external web application protection in the form of a WAF or a RASP, asset management of your custom application and third parties, very important. Like I mentioned, today's modern enterprise, their data lies with all their third parties. So very, very important to have your updated asset management list. Having least user privilege, and lastly, having a strong key and certification management services, right? So this kind of sums up how service providers need to kind of look at the version 4, start working towards it, and why it's a little different for them as compared to other merchants who need to meet PCI requirements. I'll quickly talk about some of the things about how Accorian can help organizations with their journey as they work towards version 4. So as part of version 4, like Andrea was mentioning, there's penetration testing, there's authenticated vulnerability scanning, there's policy procedures that have to be developed, updated, documented, and signed off. There is risk assessments that have to be conducted. There are security tools that have to be implemented in the form of a RASP or a WAF, or 24/7 security monitoring or automated log review, phishing, and other IAM-based checks, right? There's also elements associated with people security, security awareness, audit readiness. You need to, of course, understand whether you're meeting these requirements or not. So conducting that gap analysis internally, scoping, and you having the adequate security staff to meet this requirement. So these are some of the challenges that you need to combat and ensure that you tackle them so that you're ready for version 4. Accorian is, of course, a full service cybersecurity services company. We can help with the end-to-end security implementation, scoping, gap analysis, remediation. We can manage the penetration testing and vulnerability assessment services. We can help update the policy procedures to meet version 4 requirements. We can help with remediation advisory, control selection, and tool selection. We can also help with the security tool implementation, and of course, have our experts provide their time by virtue of virtual security or virtual CISO services. And lastly, provide our own in-house portal for evidence collection and assessment, right? And lastly, enable you to go through your audit through our PCI QSA services, right? So that's in a nutshell about how Accorian can help, what version 4 was all about, what the main updates to look out for. I'd love to get questions at this point. I think, for those of you who are dropping off, thank you so much for your time, for attending our webinar. And I hope it was informational and resourceful for you. We would be sharing the recording. If you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out to Andrea or myself on LinkedIn, and we'd be more than happy to help address any queries as you work towards your version 4 journey. All right. So, sorry, Andrea.
No worries. Nope, just going to say absolutely, we're available for if you have any other questions. And if there are none, we appreciate you being here if you're dropping off.
Sure. So, Andrea, I see 2 questions here. The first question was, should scoping be conducted by myself, or should I leverage a QSA for this service?
Yeah, so this actually holds true for pretty much any type of assessment, PCI included. It's up to the entity to define their scope. So they know what systems are in place. Your assessor may not know coming into an assessment. So you always want to have a good understanding of what you think your scope should be documented. And then what your assessor can help you with, their goal is to validate your scope. So once you define it and document it, then you work with your assessor to make sure that it makes sense, that you're getting all those tier 2 systems in place, if in fact they need to be. And then ultimately your assessor would validate the scope. So working together, you want to start with what you know, and then work with your assessor to make sure it's correct.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. There's one more question that's a funny one, which is the customized approach is a sigh of relief, right? Can I now freely design my controls? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so what we didn't get into too much was, if you're not meeting the standard way, and you don't have new technology that makes you unable to meet it in that traditional way, then you would generally have a compensating control in place to show that although you can't meet it this way, you're still attempting to meet it by putting these compensating controls in place. So what the new version, what the new methodology allows you to do is really, in those instances where it makes sense, you can define your requirement or your control. Unfortunately, it doesn't mean that you can just define all your controls and meet them the way you think you need to meet them, because remember that risk analysis needs to be there. And that's really important, that documentation of that risk analysis, because that's what your assessor is going to use to confirm whether or not it makes sense how you're meeting that control. And then, as I mentioned, the assessor, they're not going to be able to use those traditional tests to test that control because you're meeting it in different new way, that you're meeting the objective of the control, but not how it was written. So it needs to make sense so the external assessor can actually document the test that they're going to perform to show that you're in fact meeting the intent of the control. So yeah, good try, but not so much.
Thank you, Andrea. And the last question from the audience is, and I'll take this one, which is automated log review. How can we possibly meet that requirement? So automated log, I think log review is essentially over the years become, very, very complex because of the various different sources that one has to look at, review. The sheer magnitude of the logs today being generated from these devices, it goes into terabytes, right? Can it be done manually? No, not anymore. Hence, PCI recommended the automated log review methodology. And that kind of boils down to you possibly having a SIM instance in your organization, or possibly leveraging a 24/7 security monitoring service provider, or also an MDR or a managed detection and response services provider, right? I would, suggest going with a services provider for some of this is because of the added requirement of detect and respond capable, having those capabilities. So it's very, very important to, as soon as you detect it, this particular incident has been triaged, it is moved up in criticality, someone's able to act upon it within a certain SLA, and there is some response, whether it's in the form of, a firewall rule being written out, or a change in a particular configuration, etc. Right? So PCI definitely requires you to detect quickly and respond even quicker, just to ensure that the possible extent of an attack is minimized, and that at the end the credit card data is truly secure. Right? So I hope that answered the question. So that's it, folks. I think that's all the questions that we had. There've been 3. You guys have been a great audience. I appreciate all your time. Looking forward to hearing from you. And feel free to reach out to us with any queries. Thank you and goodbye.